It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Timo Riisanen, who's our Professor of Fashion Design and Sustainability here at Parsons School of Design, School of Fashion. Along with him is Yili Tang, fashion designer, and also Deborah Martin, who's the Senior Vice President of Programs from New York Restoration Project. They're going to be in conversation around fashion, architecture, and urban planning. And Timo has very graciously stepped in at short notice for Joel Towers, who was called away to another meeting. So thank you so much, Timo. So if you would just join me in welcoming them.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Fiona, for the introduction. And I also want to thank Joel Towers and also Simon Collins and Fiona for, I believe my name was mentioned in every single one of this morning's presentations. So I feel very humbled and honored. And thank you for, clearly we are a very dynamic school and we adapt to whatever we need to adapt to. And today is an incredible example of thinking on our feet. When the request came a couple of days ago from Joel to step in, I immediately said, yes, I feel very honored to sit up here with Yili and Deborah for their respective contributions to the City of New York in somewhat different fields. And if you look at the name of the presentation for this morning, it's Fashion, Architecture and Urban Planning, and I do believe that Joel Towers was the architecture piece of largely in, or at least contributed to that, and my background is in fashion rather than architecture, but we'll make this work. I also, the storm is creating some additional challenges. We are actually going to be finishing at 11:45 sharp, so we're going to keep this fairly quick today, but I will leave about 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. But because of certain things, we do need to finish at 11:45, so just be mindful of that. I'm also cutting the introduction a little bit short, if that's okay with both of you. That it's not meant as a disrespect. It's adapting to the day of today. I might start with you, Yili. You've been part of the New York fashion industry for over 3 decades now, having established Yili in 1981. As times have changed and obviously keep changing, sometimes very quickly, like today, can you speak to where you see the fashion industry in New York City heading and how it might need to adapt and develop moving forward?
Certainly. I think that talent certainly is thriving. We're sitting here at Parsons, graduating excellent students and entrepreneurs, all of whom are dependent on an infrastructure that exists up in the Garment District and in burgeoning Brooklyn, which I would love for you to talk more about with us. I think that the future is promising. However, I do feel that the city has to make a bigger commitment toward the industry, because the industry does provide diversity in jobs and pay scale, and it supports a thriving industry that's very important to New York's image and identity. Because of the success of the study made in Midtown, and at this point, I'd like to recognize the founder of the Design Trust for Public Space, who's here with us, Andy. And as a matter of fact, Deborah Martin was the executive director on the project. So because of their support, the initial study made in Midtown was very successful in that it stayed the city from rezoning the district, which gave the district some hope to reinvent itself. Now we need some big bucks to step up to the place because the infrastructure really needs investment and rebuilding. We need to become competitive globally. And I fear what will happen if we don't do that. Timo?
Great. And actually, Deborah, in your previous role at the Design Trust for Public Space, you were very involved in the Made in Midtown campaign, I believe, and you worked together as well on that campaign, Yoli and you. what were perhaps some of the lessons that, can you elaborate on some of the lessons that might be learned from the Made in Midtown? And what are some of the opportunities that lie ahead for all of us here in New York?
Well, okay, that's a big question.
Yeah, apologies.
Hang on, I'm going to just adjust this. Okay. Apparently, I'm too short for this microphone.
Turn it down.
Yeah, can you fix it?
You can turn it down.
Yeah, there we go. Good. The story of Made in Midtown, which is really the story of the garment district, is a story of making things in New York. New York used to be, the garment district up until the middle of the 20th century produced something like 90% of the clothes that Americans wore. And so you can imagine that in a short period of time, in a few decades, that use basically went offshore, right? So you're left with a kind of tiny core of craftspeople, artisans whose skills date back in some cases several generations, who are, as Yoli eloquently put, a kind of ecosystem of fashion, and that's extant, right? Like that's still there, but it's dying, and the reason that it's dying is because the people who are in that industry, those businesses, they can't pay the rent, right? Bottom line, they just can't afford the new cost of space in that neighborhood. So what we attempted to do with Made in Midtown was to rethink this connection between that industry and its kind of hidden presence in the upper floors of buildings, because it's very much alive there still, and I don't know how many of you are from New York, but I mean, if you're in that neighborhood, you have these kind of little glimpses of where that industry, where your industry intersects the street, mainly in the freight entrances and the racks that you see moving around the neighborhood, but the Design Trust, in collaboration with CFDA and really with Yoli and her partner in the project, the architect Jörg Schwartz, we attempted to rethink how we cast the identity of the neighborhood so that the uses, the fashion uses, could be kind of daylighted on the street as an experiment in connecting craft to urban design and urban planning. So that, you know, I still think that's a good idea. You asked about lessons learned, and maybe our first step, and really what stayed the change in zoning that Yoli mentioned, was that we recast the garment district rather than a dying industrial zone as a research and development hub, because we felt that by thinking of it as a research and development hub and changing the kind of image of that neighborhood, we could increase demand for things that came directly from that neighborhood, therefore driving more business to the businesses that were still there and helping them to pay the rent. That was the strategy. So I still think that that's a good strategy, and the second phase of the study, called Making Midtown, attempts to articulate how to execute that strategy. But I think it's really a matter of timing, because we recognize, and you may be aware, that the forces that drove manufacturing offshore are changing. Costs of labor and shipping that used to be very much reduced by offshoring your production is changing now, and in certain industries like appliances, it's coming back on shore. So to me, it's very sad and kind of short-sighted that the city of New York hasn't supported the industry better to see it through this kind of interim period, because I think very soon, and maybe it will be in Brooklyn, we'll realize that actually at a certain level of production and a certain price point of garment, it actually makes more sense to make it here. And that's never going to be true, let's say, for jeans or T-shirts or that kind of low-cost, high-volume garment. But for a certain level of garment, it does now and will continue to make sense to make it here. So, I mean, the lesson learned to me is really that this industry needs to have a more visible and dynamic connection to the street, so that it's not a kind of hidden thing that's available only to a sort of fashion elite, as it's sort of thought of, but rather it's a kind of artisanal and craft industry that is very closely tied to the life of the city. And I think this industry, because of its passion and because really the center of fashion since during the war, it kind of died briefly, right, in France, has been here, and because European capitals don't have the opportunities that we have here. There isn't the same kind of economic vibrancy. You all still have the chance to kind of reinvent what a fashion community looks like in a city. So to me, that's the best message that came out of Made in Midtown, at least when I was working on it still.
I can add something to visibility, that question of visibility. Because of the study, am I mic'd or not?
I think
You can hear me, right? Partially because of the study and the fact that I always desired to have a store, I actually ended up opening a retail store in the garment district, which part of the vision was to make fashion more visible at the street level. And come Monday, I'm going to be doing a show in the store, but not in my store. We're going to stage the show in the store, show across the street, so the girls will parade across 38th Street. And the second change that the girls are going to be making will be in Manny's millinery store next door. So there's a fashion intervention on Monday on 38th Street.
I think we'll all be there.
I like that.
Actually, the theme of visibility, I think, is a great one, because I think connected to that, how important do you think the stories are? And I have two specific businesses in mind. I mean, you mentioned a millinery business, but also companies like Gelberg Braid, which is one of the last manufacturers of braid here in New York City, or now my memory fails me because I'm a little bit nervous. MS Malberg for custom fabric flowers. I mean, some of the tools that this company uses to make silk flowers are 150 years old, and there's this incredible skill and expertise involved in making those things. But often when I speak to, I can understand with students that they don't know about those kinds of companies yet. But also often I speak to people in industry, they don't seem to know either, always. How important do you think that it is to tell those kinds of stories? And I think, to some extent, Made in Midtown, as you Deborah, mentioned, it was about getting the stories across as well. And how do we perhaps better get those stories across and make sure that the stories remain vibrant? And because I think, Yeli, you made a great point just before we got on stage about saving. And I feel the same way. You know, sometimes preserving something, it sounds like we're going to put something in a pickle jar and just look at it how it once was. But really, I think the understanding is, the common understanding is that we ought to revitalize and keep things vibrant. But how do we perhaps keep those stories present to the wider community? Because I do think that those stories
I really
people.
think it's in the public realm. I mean, it's up to the interest of the people. Because, you know, it was serendipitous, you know, that the Manny's millinery story for me is a very personal one, but it's quite interesting because when we were in the 38th Street is very heavily trafficked. So for the girls to come back and change in my studio would be very difficult. So when we were in the raw space, the way that I met Manny was I had a band. They were playing a guitar, a banjo, and a fiddle. And Howard, Manny's son, wandered into the store because from the back of his store, he could hear live music, and he was enchanted. So that's how come we ended up dressing in his store. But when I went to see him, you talked about Marlberg. Well, he has all the die cuts for making flowers, because he used to do flowers for the hats. And he bought himself a new press, and he's going to try and cast the dies for flowers in metal so that he can sell them as jewelry or accessories. So Manny's son, Howard, is trying to reinvent his business, but nobody knows about it. So back to your question, it's like, how do you get these stories out there? I mean, somebody has to be interested enough to investigate and to write about it. And then, you know, you need designers and manufacturers to be interested in working with him so that he can rebuild his business in another arena. Now, Stanley Pleating is another local supplier, and he did everything from pleating to all kinds of trim, faggoting, and all sorts of detail work. He had to get rid of most of his machinery because his space kept shrinking. So he reinvented himself by buying a laser machine, and now he does laser cutting. But there again, I don't know how many people in the audience or in the schools know about all these processes that are going on. And then lastly, Regal, for instance, he's a great pleater, and he kept one of a kind of all of his machines. He just merged with the New York Binding Company, and they moved out to Long Island City. He's left the garment district. So these are all the stories that one can tell, but how do you get them out there?
And I think that's actually a nice lead. And you mentioned earlier too, in preparing for today, I mentioned to both Deborah and Yoli, there seems to be this almost like a second garment district emerging in Brooklyn, but I think also I've heard references to Long Island City before as well in Queens. But partly it's in the form of new kinds of incubators, and I believe there are some friends from Pratt here who they've got an incubator based in Brooklyn, and also I know that there's another incubator launching in the next couple of months called Manufacture NYC, and also there's more established companies like Andrew Greenfield, the tailor, is based in Bushwick and has been for a long, long time, and certainly, you know, the people that I've spoken with from some of those initiatives, the new initiatives, is the aim isn't to compete with Midtown, but rather it's to function as a satellite, I guess, and
to extend the industry.
To extend the industry, and for especially for a lot of the younger startups, rents in Manhattan can be prohibitive, and Brooklyn can be the more financially feasible option, I guess.
I think we better start looking at the Bronx.
Absolutely. Well, why not all 5 boroughs?
Yes.
Make it a 5 boroughs project. So Staten Island as well. I just apologize because I am really, really adapting very quickly. Now, earlier in her presentation, Fiona briefly mentioned a project that we're engaging at Parsons called Local Wisdom, which is actually an international fashion research project. It was initiated by Dr. Kate Fletcher at London College of Fashion, which is also one of the partner universities in the Colloquia series. And Local Wisdom is the name refers to the kind of wisdom that individuals have in relation to how we use clothes. And over the last 4 years, the project has uncovered some beautiful use practices with clothing, just from everyday individuals. But I think there's if you expand the idea of local wisdom to the garment industry in New York City, and also companies that have just been mentioned, I mean, the expertise and skill in those small companies, and really with individuals within those companies, is incredible. If you speak to, and obviously, Oli, you have spoken to the people that make the custom fabric flowers and so forth. What would you like to see, perhaps, in terms of education? Because sometimes, like I certainly try and talk about those things to my students as much as I can, but I'd love to hear, perhaps, from both of you, that what role might education play in keeping this industry of ours, and also the city of ours, because I think the two are completely interlinked. What role might we as educators play in that longer-term plan of keeping the garment industry vibrant?
Well, I think I want to go back to an earlier question of yours and kind of connect it to this question about education. The question about what the story is, I think, is a critical one. And I don't know how many of you have looked at the Made in Midtown site, but the strategy of that website, it has many interviews, video interviews with the craftspeople that Yoli described. Some of those people actually are on the website. You can hear them speak about their work. And you know, the community of people who serve your industry is really quite extraordinary and rich. But I think relying on, and I'm not sort of accusing this audience of doing this, but relying on a sense of nostalgia about or a longing for an idea of craft from the past it's just not going to work, because the fact is that these businesses have to be viable on their own terms, and New York has never been a city that's kind to kind of old-fashioned ideas of ways of doing things. So now moving and making this connection to education, what I would say is you need to find, as people who are kind of coming up in the industry, ways, if you value these crafts and the skills that they represent, you need to find ways to reinvent them for now, so that, you know, bottom line, these businesses need to have increase their volume, and they need to find a place where they can produce at a level, at an optimal level. There's kind of a larger story. The larger story, in a way, about New York fashion industry is a sort of lack of investment at the city level, because other fashion, you know, places where they really do state-of-the-art fashion production, those places at the municipal level have invested in technology that we don't even have in the city at all, right? Like knitting technologies, cutting technologies, laser, that we don't have at all, because the question of the garment industry in the second part of the 20th century in New York was always weighed down and beleaguered by the cost of rent. And there wasn't municipal investment in pulling the industry into the 21st century. So I would say that the role of educators is to understand that larger narrative and to figure out how New York can now kind of slot itself into what's still here and celebrate that. Because I don't know that New York City, maybe, I know that there are efforts by various leaders in the fashion industry to kind of bring us into the 21st century the way other places are. I don't know that they're going to succeed. I don't know that we will catch up to Shanghai or places like that. But we have some things that they don't have, and the point of education, I guess I would suggest, is knowing, evaluating what we still have and building on that. And we have a certain kind of startup dynamism, because the ticket to entry here is lower than other places. If you want to start here, you could put your samples in your backpack and go to the guy who has the braid and go to the flower maker or whatever. You can still do that here. So the point is to build on that without being nostalgic about it, and find a way to increase the volume of work that those industries have.
That's another point that I can add to the lack of investment on the part of the manufacturers. They have a sense of uncertainty about their future because their leases are so short, and the leases are kept short because of the pressure of rent. You know, nobody has a lease that's more than 2 years. So how can you invest in equipment?
Right.
You have no promise of a future.
And, you know, just to unpack that, the reason that people have short leases like that, and the reason that, you know, fashion industry participants felt like they couldn't invest in make these larger investments, is because this is Manhattan, and property owners have long been feeling like we should be getting more rent in this middle of Manhattan, and the zoning was such that they could not get more rent. So that's why the story that we together, Leolian and I and the other design trusts and the other participants in Made in Midtown were trying to do, was to say that there's something special about things that are made in this neighborhood, and therefore you should be willing to pay more for them, and you should want it more. That's the story we were trying to tell. Whether that story will prevail in Manhattan or Brooklyn, I don't know.
Well, we also proved the point of proximity and creativity being really linked. And that brings up the question, which I want to raise for both of you. If we have satellites of manufacturing throughout the boroughs, you know, how do we link them, and how do we communicate, and how do we value the proximity issue when things are more spread out? How do we deal with that? Because if we can have like satellites of manufacturing, but it's all very coherent and connected to the whole, it's actually more powerful. But I think some thought, and city planning has to really jump in my mind. I mean, I don't know how much it costs to build a stadium, but a manufacturing center of excellence cannot be as costly as a stadium like Barclays Center is, right?
Right. No, I mean, if New York City wanted to invest in a kind of manufacturing hub, it could do that. The fact is that that's not a priority for the city right now because the city has kind of given up on manufacturing. We want designers here, and they'll be here because this is New York for a while, at least, let's hope. But whether the city of New York will invest in this industry's infrastructure or not, I think is kind of an open question. I think the question of proximity is going to be addressed by all of you, and I would draw an analogy between the ecosystem of fashion and an ecosystem, you know, in a forest or a wetland or a jungle or whatever. Things settle where they need to settle. So if people need to be able to walk somewhere to get something done quickly and to feel a fabric or whatever, they're going to locate themselves in a place where they can do that. Whether the city supports that or not depends to some extent on the dynamism of the industry and whether it attracts and pushes out a narrative of vibrancy and a new vision for where it's going in the 21st century that can compete with other capitals. Because in the end, that's really what it's about.
I think it's a great point about being able to touch and feel, and I think Fiona touched in her presentation before us just the idea of craftsmanship. A year ago, I sent one of my students to, she was working on her final collection, I sent her to Gelberg Braid, which is literally a 5-minute walk from my classroom. And I expected her to be back in about 45 minutes at the very latest. She came back 3 hours later, and she was shaking with excitement, and she came back with a lot more samples than I expected to see. But, you know, when she'd gone there, the staff there showed her how these machines that make the braids and the cords and so forth actually worked and explained the whole processes. And I think those 3 hours changed this one student's life because she just saw where all this stuff that so often we fashion designers can take for granted, but she actually saw the source in some ways for this one thing. But it was a completely transformative moment, I think, in her life. It was visible, visible on this person, and I do think that it's, and I just want to share that story because it's the same. You know, every time I send students to look at the custom fabric flowers, for example, when they see things made, it's the same kind of magical moment. And I know that Yoli, you've, I believe in your book, you've actually said the close of magic, and it's in those moments that I can completely see that. I actually forgot to when I started. I should have said. Simon, in his presentation earlier, mentioned that my transformative moment 2.5 years ago about zero waste, which we did as a project here. So zero waste was my PhD topic, and I finished my PhD back in October. But I was saying to Yoli before that I cannot imagine what those 8 years would have been like had it not been for your pioneering work over the 30 years. So I'm going to thank you publicly for that. So thank you. Given the time constraints, I would like to now turn it over to the audience and see if there are any questions. Yes, Namkyu. Do we have a microphone?
Timo, you know, we didn't connect the zero waste and sustainability to the sense of place.
Let's do that.
That's right.
Let's do that before we leave today.
Hi, my name is Nam Kyu Chun. I'm not from School of Fashion, but I'm from MFA Fashion, a transdisciplinary design program at Parsons. But as a former fashion design student with a love of fashion and the garment district, currently I'm developing some project that relate to the garment district. And we have a chance to interact with all these people from the street in the garment district. And recently we realized that the garment district it can be seen as an industry, but it's more like a community in the street level. There's different people, and then like in that sense, like we can see different component of the garment district, like such as like culture, infrastructure, and other component of the community, rather than garment district as an industrial or as a factory or manufacturing system of the garment industry. So like we are thinking that with our project, like what if we can use some other component of this community, such as like tourists from the Times Square everywhere in New York City, or the education system including Parsons and FIT, using, as Timo just mentioned, like using the Gammon district as a school, part of school education system. Like I think the solution of the using the Gammon district in different sense can be we can find some other component of the community rather than just finding solution from the existing very closed system of fashion or industrial economic level. So I want to hear about like what do you think about this more open collaborative system of a component of the community, and then what we can see as a potential scenario of the Gammon district maybe 2.0, yeah, I would say, rather than like, yeah.
Have you read the Made in Midtown report?
Of course.
Or Making because I mean, much of what you're suggesting is what that project recommends.
Right.
So,
but I found that from yesterday, like from the interview from the street, I also interact with like also fashion centered business BID people from the street, and then actually they didn't know about all this like interesting project, and then we also have a chance to talk to somebody who live in Staten Island, but they don't know anything about like they know existence of the Gammon district, but like they don't know anything about like this interaction and like joining issue, and like so maybe what we need is more visibility and like more sharing information about this interesting movement or interesting project from school or a nonprofit organization or the industry, like sharing this interesting approach with more larger audience to attract more people, to create more interaction, and then try to connect that individual strengths to create more huge signal to change this, I don't know, to improve this existing system.
So what do you suggest?
I don't know. That will be, we are currently developing this project, so you can hear maybe at maybe April at the end of
that would be much appreciated, because it is what we sought.
Yes.
And it is what what you articulated are actually all the conclusions that we drew.
Yeah.
And they are the solutions that we seek answers to. So you must contact us.
Yeah, sure.
And if I can add to that too, Namkyu and Nelson, who've been working on this project, that is one example of, this is a bigger conversation that I've been having pretty much all year with Hazel Clark, our research chair of fashion, how fashion at Parsons is cropping up, not just in the School of Fashion, but it's really coming up in a number of departments. As Namkyu mentioned, he's in MFA Transdisciplinary Design. And I've also had conversations with students from our design and management program, which is in a completely separate, it's in the School of Design Strategies. And it's really interesting to see how this, all these different people from very different backgrounds are attracted to fashion, because I think a lot of people are recognizing that fashion is a very dynamic field, and we are very adaptable. To whatever circumstances we're faced with, particularly today. And there's, this is just one great example of these kinds of conversations coming together, and I particularly feel privileged. I think because of my particular title, people feel I seem to be one of the people at Parsons that those students tend to connect to, the students from outside of fashion who nonetheless somehow address fashion. So absolutely, we want to hear more from you over the next couple of months, and all the best with the thesis project about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. If anyone can. And I can relay, as long as I can hear, I can relay it to the 5 more minutes.
The thing is that I can't see you. The thing is that it does cost quite a bit to put a center, but it's on Flatbush Avenue. I'm from Brooklyn. Quite frankly, a lot of us really don't want that on Flatbush Avenue. But he says 2.0. But can you sell 2.0? On my birthday, I wanted to do something. They had Justin Bieber sold out at the Barclays Center. They're selling tickets over there big time. The Rolling Stones, all of that. So Barclays is making their money back. They're not just sitting there. 2, the art world was much more sunny to me in Soho than Chelsea. Chelsea is very dark and damp. Soho is very bright and sunny. But guess who came and gave us the boot? Fashion. Now, I'm from Brooklyn. What are you going? You keep talking about coming to Brooklyn. Everybody's coming to Brooklyn. We're from Brooklyn. We don't want you in Brooklyn. You're coming to Brooklyn.
It's too late.
What are you going to do for the community? Or are you just giving us the boot? How are you incorporating yourself and blending in, helping, doing something for the community? Or just coming there like you did to Soho and everybody's evicted and gone? You know, even in Lincoln Center, I was just talking to somebody here. We're walking around, and they're asking, what are you? Who are you? What do you mean, who am I? What am I? Dancer, musician. Are we not in Lincoln Center? You know? You know, befriend us. All the other art worlds are together. Music, dance, come with us.
I can take that.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I will respond to that because, yes, I would say that over decades past, fashion has done a great job of isolating itself and sort of separating itself from a wider community. There's kind of a lot of myth building that happens in fashion, but the things that I was referring to earlier in Brooklyn, particularly the kinds of incubators that are happening, these tend to be collectives of very small businesses, literally on the level of one-person startups, and they tend to be people that are living in Brooklyn as well, so they are part of the community. It's not as if it's fashion coming from outside and planting something in there, but it really is actually growing out of the community itself, and but also with great reverence and respect for what's already in Midtown, and so I just if I gave the misconception that it's Midtown coming to plant something in Brooklyn, then that's certainly not the case.
I would add also that you have to make a distinction between retail, and fashion manufacturing. Fashion manufacturing was actually a provider of many, many high-paying working-class jobs. So to say that fashion is not an industry that provides middle-class jobs is just incorrect. Okay, good.
Mic, please.
Can we have the microphone, please, Rich?
Two things that have really come out of what you've talked about is storytelling and craftsmanship, and those are two of the kind of oldest things that have existed through centuries, regardless of whether digital technology is going on, etc. And coming back to this lady's comment here in relation to communities, a lot of storytelling and craftsmanship came out of communities working together. So I think maybe, do you think that the future of that industry is about capitalising, and maybe that's not actually the right word, is combining together and conversing with those local communities like we're doing here with a conversation, which is what this is based on, having conversations, because as we know, the best ideas come out of conversations, and involving the talent that sits also outside of fashion, because we're moving now towards more collaboration, which Fiona talked about, and involving them, instead of them feeling like someone's coming into an industry, they're not coming to make something, they're coming to build with the community that already exists.
Could I take a stab at this before we have to break?
Yeah. And I just wanted to also say, in regards to fashion and how it's become, through rapid technologies, it's become globalized, I think that personally speaking, sometimes what's happened with the different cities is it's almost, we had a conversation myself at university, how a lot of students are very similar and they're very more international, so it's more global. Whereas then what happens, this affects the fashion industry for a good, but also what sometimes can happen is it's about redefining what is the unique parts of New York that you could only do in New York and you could only do in London, and would only to re-establish people to respect that about New York and respect that about London or Paris or all those different cities. And it's almost bringing back to the storytelling, the craftsmanship and the local wisdom that was also mentioned in Fiona's talk. And by doing that kind of, what I sort of got out of the local wisdom is what they've done there, they've really connected with their community. And I think, do you think, maybe a question back to you, the answer is the connection more of finding what the uniqueness is and not trying to compete with kind of the global industry of whether you make jeans cheaper or more expensive, but more about what are those uniqueness things in New York and how you can bring them out to the rest of the world, I guess.
I think I'm going to reduce this to very simple terms. You know, there was once more than a few factories that provided more than a few jobs that were well-paying. And they supported industries that grew and made a lot of money. That layer took the work and put it overseas. Consequently, what's left in the garment district is suffering. And it's the community that's suffering. You know, there's when you talk about fashion, it's so multi-layered. I mean, when you talk about fashion, you know, Uniqlo is part of fashion. They own Theory. Those people are beyond our conversation. They own fashion. What we're concerned here are students at Parsons graduating, being brilliant and creative, and having an opportunity without much capital to take their work out there, sell it, get it made without Papa or Mama's dollars, and make a living and make a big success of themselves. The infrastructure gives them that opportunity. The infrastructure is under threat. That's really essentially what this conversation is about.
Well said.
And I would finish by saying that the conversation won't finish here. Today is just the launch.
Do we continue?
Yes. But I want to really thank Yoli Tang and Deborah Martin for making it here on such an extraordinary day, particularly during I know Yoli is showing, like she said, on Monday, and I know that, Deborah, you've got other things happening today. So thank you so very much for thank you.
And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.